They noticed you without meaning to. That's the dangerous part. Not because you tried to be seen, not because you asked for attention, but because something about you broke their pattern. People with real power don't scan rooms like everyone else. They don't look for noise. They don't chase validation. They observe for disruption. And you disrupted them. At first it was subtle, almost dismissible, a fraction of a second too long, a pause where none was expected, a question that wasn't asked out loud but landed anyway. They caught two things about you, and once they did, looking away became impossible. The first thing was your absence of need. You didn't lead forward when power entered the room. You didn't shrink. You didn't perform. Your body language said something most people never say: I'm not here to take from you. That alone unsettles those who are used to being needed. Power is fed by hunger, by people wanting something: approval, access, safety, validation. But you weren't hungry. You listened without chasing. You spoke without selling. You were present without trying to be remembered. That kind of neutrality reads as confidence to those who know the game. Because only two kinds of people don't seek power's attention: those who don't understand it, and those who don't need it. They ruled out the first one quickly. You were too aware, too measured, too precise in when you chose silence, which led them to the second realization: you didn't need them. And that's when curiosity sharpened into focus. The second thing they caught was harder to explain. It wasn't something you said. It wasn't something you did. It was something you withheld. Most people leak themselves constantly. Their fears slip out. Their desires announce themselves. Their insecurities beg to be managed. But you didn't leak. You contained yourself. Your reactions were controlled, not suppressed. Your emotions were present, not broadcast. Your confidence wasn't loud. It was economical. You didn't overshare your story. You didn't rush to prove depth. You didn't weaponize vulnerability for connection. You let gaps exist, and gaps drive powerful people insane, because gaps create mystery, and mystery suggests leverage. They couldn't tell what you wanted. They couldn't map your incentives. They couldn't predict your next move. And for someone used to controlling rooms, predicting outcomes, and reading people like open files, you were unreadable. That's when the shift happened. They stopped observing you casually. They started tracking you, not in an obvious way, not with direct questions, but with awareness. They noticed when you entered. They noticed when you didn't. They paid attention to who gravitated toward you without you calling them. They watched how conversations subtly reorganized around your presence. Not because you dominated them, but because you didn't compete. You listened in a way that made others reveal themselves. You asked questions that weren't invasive but disarming. You let people feel seen without offering yourself in return. That's a rare skill. And rare skills trigger two instincts in powerful people: interest and caution. They began testing you. Small tests at first. A comment meant to provoke. A subtle flex of status. A moment where they expected you to react. You didn't. Not out of fear. Out of choice. You responded when it mattered. You stayed silent when silence carried more weight. That restraint told them something dangerous. You had internal hierarchy. You weren't reacting to the room. The room was reacting to you. And then came the moment they couldn't ignore. A moment so small no one else noticed it. You disagreed. Without confrontation. You asserted. Without dominance. You stood your ground. Without theatrics. You didn't frame it as a challenge. You framed it as reality. And reality, when calmly stated, overrides authority. That's when they realize something most people never realize about power. True power doesn't announce itself. It recognizes its own. They weren't looking at confidence anymore. They were looking at self-possession. The kind that doesn't need permission. The kind that isn't borrowed from titles, roles, or affiliations. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you won't trade. That's when their attention shifted from curiosity to evaluation. They started asking themselves questions. Where did you come from? What shaped you? Why aren't you impressed? What do you see that others don't? And the most important one, are you an asset or a threat? Because people with serious power don't fear competition. They fear unpredictability. And you were controlled, not controllable. They noticed how you didn't rush outcomes, how you allowed time to work for you, how you didn't chase alignment. You allowed it to reveal itself. That patience signals long-term thinking, and long-term thinkers are dangerous. They don't burn energy impulsively. They don't need immediate wins. They don't trade leverage for applause. They wait, and waiting, when done intentionally, is a form of dominance. They also noticed something else, something that unsettled them more than your call. You weren't trying to climb. You weren't positioning yourself above anyone. You weren't positioning yourself above anyone. You weren't playing status games. You weren't angling for proximity, which meant if you moved, it wouldn't be upward by permission. It would be sideways, or independent. And independence is the one thing power cannot fully control. That's when their behavior changed. They started offering openings, opportunities framed as generosity, access disguised as coincidence, not because they wanted to reward you, but because they wanted to understand you, to see how you'd move with more space, to see what you do with leverage, to see if your restraint would crack. You didn't rush into it. You didn't overvalue the offer. You didn't reject it either. You evaluated calmly, quietly, on your terms, and that hesitation told them everything. You weren't dazzled. You weren't desperate. You weren't operating from lack. You were deciding. That's when the realization landed fully. You weren't someone to impress. You were someone to watch. Because the people who move slowly, speak selectively, and remain internally anchored are the ones who change the direction of rooms without announcing it. They couldn't look away now, not because you were loud, but because you were centered. Not because you demanded respect, but because your presence reorganized it. And here's the part most people don't understand. Once someone with real power identifies those two things, your lack of need and your self-containment, they never unsee it. Even when they're not watching you, they are measuring others against you. Even when they don't speak to you, they are aware of where you are. Even when they seem indifferent, they are adjusting. Because you introduced uncertainty into a system that thrives on predictability. And uncertainty, when controlled, is influence. This is only the beginning, because now that they've seen you, the next phase isn't observation. It's positioning. They didn't approach you right away. People with serious power rarely do. They let time test you first. They watched how you behaved when nothing was offered, when no one was validating you, when there was no audience, no reward, no pressure. Because the real question wasn't whether you were impressive. It was whether you were consistent. Power doesn't trust intensity. It trusts patterns. And your pattern stayed solid. You didn't change when attention faded. You didn't lean in when silence returned. You didn't compensate. You remained exactly who you were when they first noticed you. That's when they began to understand something deeper. You weren't performing strength. You were operating from it. Most people shift when circumstances shift. Their tone changes. Their posture adjusts. Their confidence leaks. But you didn't recalibrate yourself to the room. You recalibrated the room to you. Without effort. Without assertion. Without explanation. That unsettled them more than anything else. Because power is used to being the reference point, and you were referencing something internal, something they couldn't access. They began to replay moments in their mind. That first pause you took before answering, the way you didn't rush to agree, the calm way you let others finish, even when they were wrong. You never corrected anyone publicly. You never embarrassed anyone privately. You let people expose themselves. That's not kindness. That's discipline. They noticed how people felt strangely comfortable around you, how guards dropped, how conversations deepened unintentionally. People revealed fears to you without realizing they were doing it. Shared frustrations they hadn't planned to voice. Admitted things they usually protect. You didn't exploit that. You didn't store it to use later. You simply listened. And listening, when done without agenda, is disarming. That's when the second layer of attention began. Not curiosity. Assessment. They started testing your boundaries more deliberately, not aggressively, subtly. A delayed response, a shifted plan, an unspoken expectation. They wanted to see if you would chase alignment. You didn't. You adjusted without resentment. You moved without complaint. You maintained your internal pace. You didn't punish. You didn't please. You responded. That told them you weren't reactive. Reactive people are easy to manage, predictable, programmable, but you weren't reacting to stimulus. You were acting from principle, and principles are harder to manipulate than emotions. They tried another approach. They gave you proximity, not authority, not control, just closeness. Rooms you hadn't been invited into before. Conversations that weren't meant for everyone. Silence is heavy with implication. They wanted to see if power would intoxicate you. If you'd lean in, if you'd overstep, if you'd mistake access for alignment. You didn't. You treated proximity like weather. Not a promotion, not a prize, just an environment to observe. You spoke when you had something real to add. You stayed quiet when you didn't. You didn't perform loyalty. You didn't signal ambition. You didn't signal anything. And that neutrality did something strange. It shifted the balance. Because when someone doesn't want what you're offering, you start wondering what they already have. They began to notice how you moved through tension. When disagreements surfaced, you didn't escalate or withdraw. You didn't take sides emotionally. You clarified. You separated facts from feelings. You acknowledged perspectives without absorbing them. You didn't need to win arguments. You needed clarity. And clarity threatens chaos. They realized something important. You weren't trying to be powerful. You were trying to be accurate. Accurate with your words. Accurate with your energy. Accurate with your commitments. And accuracy creates trust faster than charm ever could. They also noticed what you didn't do. You didn't gossip. You didn't triangulate. You didn't build alliances in the shadows. You didn't speak about people who weren't present. That's rare, because most people bond through exclusion. You bonded through presence. That signaled integrity, and integrity in power circles is both admired and feared. Admired because it stabilizes systems. Feared because it limits control. They started including you in decisions, not formally, casually. What do you think? How would you handle this? Am I missing something? Not because they needed your approval, but because they respected your calibration. Your answers weren't dramatic. They weren't absolute. They were measured. You considered long-term consequences, human cost, structural impact. You didn't optimize for ego. You optimized for outcome. And outcomes are what power ultimately cares about. They began trusting you with ambiguity, incomplete information, unfinished ideas, sensitive dynamics. They watched how you handled it. You didn't rush to conclusions. You didn't leak uncertainty as confidence. You asked better questions. Questions that slowed things down. Questions that exposed blind spots. Questions that reframed problems instead of inflaming them. That's when they understood the second thing fully. You weren't just self-contained. You were self-regulating. Your emotions didn't drive your decisions. Your decisions didn't need emotional justification. You could sit inside discomfort without trying to escape it. Most people can't. They numb it. They react to it. They hand it to someone else. You held it. And holding tension without flinching is a leadership trait. Even if you never asked to lead, they began comparing you to others, quietly, noticing how others rushed to please, how others postured, how others overpromised and underdelivered, and then noticing how you did the opposite. You underplayed, you overdelivered, you stayed grounded. They didn't praise you publicly. They don't do that with people they're still evaluating. Instead, they created scenarios, pressure without warning, decisions with incomplete safety nets, moments where failure was possible. They wanted to see what you'd protect, your image, your comfort, your status, or the integrity of the situation. You protected the situation. You took responsibility without drama. You corrected course without blaming. You absorbed pressure without transferring it. That told them you weren't fragile. And fragile people are liabilities. They also noticed something else. When things went well, you didn't inflate. You didn't claim credit. You didn't attach your identity to success. You acknowledged contribution. You redirected praise. You moved on. That emotional neutrality toward outcomes told them you weren't addicted to validation. And people who aren't addicted can't be controlled with praise or fear. That's when their attention shifted again, from evaluation to strategy. They began thinking about placement. Where do you fit? Where do you disrupt? Where do you stabilize? Because you were no longer just interesting, you were useful. But usefulness introduces risk. If placed incorrectly, you could destabilize things, expose weaknesses, refuse compromises others rely on. They needed to understand your values, so they tested them. Ethical gray zones, convenient shortcuts, moments where silence would protect comfort. They watched closely. You didn't preach. You didn't judge. You declined participation quietly. You didn't dramatize refusal. You didn't moralize. You simply didn't cross lines. And that consistency closed the file. You weren't flexible in the ways that mattered. They understood now. You weren't someone to bend. You were someone to align with or avoid, because misalignment with someone like you creates friction that can't be smoothed over. You don't explode. You don't splode. You don't spotage. You disengage. And disengagement from someone centered is louder than conflict. That's when the dynamic inverted. They stopped testing you. They started adjusting themselves around you. Their tone softened. their explanations became clearer, their commitments more precise, because they knew you were watching patterns too, not judging, observing, and being observed by someone who sees clearly is uncomfortable. They realized something quietly. You weren't trying to enter their world. You were building your own gravity, and gravity doesn't chase, it pulls. Now, something else began happening. Others noticed the shift. They didn't know why. They couldn't articulate it, but they felt it. They saw how conversations paused when you spoke, how decisions slowed to include your perspective, how your absence was noted. You hadn't asked for influence, but influence arrived anyway. And here's the critical point. Power noticed that too. They noticed how you changed the environment without authority. That made you different from everyone else in the room. Authority can be revoked, titles can be reassigned, access can be cut, but influence earned through presence is portable, and portable influence is dangerous because it doesn't depend on structures. It survives transitions. They understood now why they couldn't look away. You weren't just a variable. You were a constant, something steady in a system built on fluctuation, something grounded in a culture of performance, something real in an ecosystem of optics. And real things expose illusions. This is the moment most people never reach, where power stops asking, "Who are you?" and starts asking, "What do we do with you?" Because from here, there are only three paths: absorb you, neutralize you, or stay permanently aware of you. And which path they choose depends on something you may not even realize yet. The next phase isn't about them watching you, it's about you recognizing the leverage you already have. Because awareness without self-knowledge is still vulnerability. And now, by now, the atmosphere around you has changed, not dramatically, not loudly, subtly. Power doesn't announce shifts, it feels them, and they feel you. They feel the way rooms recalibrate when you arrive, the way conversations become more deliberate, the way people choose words more carefully. That's not respect, that's awareness, because awareness is what precedes recalculation. They stop wondering who you are. Now they're trying to understand how you operate, because anyone who reaches this phase without asking for it, without signaling ambition, without leveraging attention, is not accidental. They begin mapping you the way strategists map terrain, not what you say, but when you speak, not what you do, but what you refuse to do, not where you engage, but where you engage, but where you withdraw. They notice that you don't react immediately. You let moments breathe. You allow silence to stretch just long enough for truth to surface. You don't rush to fill gaps. You let others reveal urgency while you remain anchored. That tells them something most people never understand. You don't experience time the same way. You're not operating on anxiety time. You're operating on decision time. And decision time belongs to those who aren't afraid of consequences. They start noticing patterns they missed before. How you don't escalate when provoked. How you don't soften when flattered. How praise slides past you the same way criticism does. You don't feed either, because you're not negotiating your identity with the room. You've already decided who you are, and people with real power know how rare that is. They see it in your posture, not rigid, not submissive, neutral, centered, as if gravity itself runs through you. They begin to sense something uncomfortable. You're not optimizing for approval, which means you're not easily steered. That changes the dynamic. Now every interaction with you carries weight because you're not a follower, and you're not trying to be a leader. You're something else, an independent axis. And independent axis destabilize hierarchies. They start watching how others behave around you. Who defers unconsciously? Who seeks your reaction before speaking? Who becomes defensive without you saying a word? You don't exploit this. You don't highlight it. You let it happen. That restraint makes it worse for them, because unchecked influence grows quietly, and quiet growth is the most dangerous kind. They begin to feel a tension they can't name. You're not challenging them, but you're not affirming them either. You're not opposing power. You're not submitting to it. You're existing beside it. And that's a problem, because systems of power are built on contrast. Above, below, inside, outside. You don't fit cleanly into any of those. You're adjacent, and adjacency creates options. They start wondering what you see, what you've noticed but haven't said, because people like you don't miss much. You notice the inconsistencies, the emotional,